The story of Rome 1960 begins not with the roar of a crowd, nor the gleam of medals, but with silence. The silence of a city that had once ruled the world and then watched itself fall into ruin. In the years after the Second World War, Rome was a city caught between its imperial past and an uncertain future. Its streets, lined with the remains of an empire, were filled now with the noise of mopeds, the smell of fresh plaster, the rhythm of reconstruction. Italy, scarred by dictatorship and defeat, was learning to stand again. The choice of Rome as host city for the 1960 Olympic Games was more than a sporting decision. It was a gesture of rebirth. A chance for a nation once broken by war to show that its spirit had survived. For Italians, it was redemption, an opportunity to prove that art, beauty, and endurance still lived in the heart of their capital. The world that would come to Rome in 1960 was no longer the same world that had gathered in Berlin 24 years earlier. Empires had crumbled, borders had shifted, and a Cold War now divided humanity into two ideologies locked in quiet combat. Yet for 17 days that summer the Eternal City would become neutral ground, a place where East and West, North and South, would share the same track, the same pool, the same applause. As preparations began, cranes dotted the skyline, rising beside the ancient domes and ruins. New venues took shape. The Stadio Olimpico, vast and gleaming beneath the hills, the Palazzo dello Sport, a dome of steel and light designed by the visionary architect Pier Luigi Nervi, and the Villaggio Olimpico, a modern village built to house the athletes of the world. It was modern Rome, born from the bones of the old. Cinecittà, the great film studios that had given the world La Dolce Vita, lent their designers and craftsmen to the Olympic project. Sculptors, painters, engineers, and cinematographers worked side by side. The games would not merely be held in Rome, they would be staged, directed, illuminated like a grand epic. Television cameras, still rare in homes, would broadcast the spectacle live across continents. For the first time in history, humanity could witness the Olympics in real time. As the date approached, excitement swept through the city. Posters appeared on every corner, Giochi della 17 Olympiade. Schoolchildren practiced greetings in English, French, and Russian. The sound of hammers and marching bands mingled in the air. Rome was not just preparing for sport, it was preparing to welcome the world. And the world in turn was changing. From Africa, a new wave of nations was stepping into independence. Ghana, Nigeria, Sudan, Tunisia. For many, Rome 1960 would be their first Olympic appearance as sovereign states. From Asia came Japan and India, rebuilding identities of their own. The United States arrived with its confident stride, the Soviet Union with its disciplined precision. Between them, the quiet rivalry of two superpowers would play out through muscle and motion rather than missiles. For 17 days, the Cold War would soften under the Roman sun. Inside the organizing committee's offices near the Tiber, General Giulio Onesti and his team faced a challenge that was both logistical and symbolic: to blend the weight of history with the promise of modernity. Every venue was placed with purpose. The marathon route, tracing the ancient Appian Way, would finish at the Arch of Constantine, a deliberate echo of Rome's imperial triumphs. Fencing would be held in the baths of Caracalla, boxing beneath frescoed ceilings, gymnastics in marble halls. It was as if the past itself had agreed to host the future. The opening ceremony arrived on the 25th of August, under a sky so blue it seemed painted. 83 nations marched into the Stadio Olimpico. The crowd of 100,000 rose as the Italian flag was raised and the anthem filled the air. The President of Italy, Giovanni Granchi, declared the games open. And then from the steps of the stadium, the Olympic flame entered, carried by a young athlete named Giancarlo Paris, a student from Viterbo whose father had died in the war. When he lit the cauldron, Rome burst into applause that seemed to echo across centuries. For the world watching on flickering screens, this was not just a ceremony. It was a statement. That beauty and civilization could rise again after ruin. that humanity, though divided by politics and power, still shared the same breath, the same need to celebrate its endurance. As night fell on that first day, Rome glowed with torchlight and possibility. The city's fountains shimmered, the ruins whispered, and the athletes of the world lay awake in their dormitories, dreaming of gold and glory. They came from every corner of the earth, boxers and swimmers, sprinters and wrestlers, men and women from countries that had never before stood on equal footing. Among them was a quiet Ethiopian soldier, unknown, unheralded, who would soon make history without a sound. But that is a story for another night. For now Rome breathed again. The eternal city, scarred but unbroken, had reclaimed its voice. And as dawn approached on the second day of the games, the bells of St. Peter's rang over the Tiber, calling not for prayer or politics, but for play, for unity, for the simple joy of watching the world run together once more. The morning after the opening ceremony, Rome awoke to a sound it had never heard before, the heartbeat of the world. Buses rumbled along the newly paved roads of the Olympic Village. Flags from 83 nations fluttered under the golden August light. Athletes in crisp uniforms filled the courtyards, trading pins, smiles, and cautious glances. For the first time in history, the Olympic Village was not a military barracks or a collection of temporary huts. It was a living symbol of coexistence, modern, open, and alive. Every corridor spoke a different language. Italian mingled with Russian, English with Swahili, Japanese with Arabic. Reporters called it a babel of friendship, and perhaps it was, a small world in miniature, fragile but hopeful. The Cold War may have divided continents, but within those walls young men and women ate in the same dining halls, trained in the same fields, and walked the same sunlit streets. American sprinters greeted Soviet gymnasts with polite curiosity. Polish rowers shared cigarettes with French cyclists. The tension of governments seemed, for a brief moment, irrelevant. For the organizers, it was a logistical miracle. Each day nearly 7,000 meals were served: pasta, rice, lamb, fish, and fruits from every region. The Italians, proud of their cuisine, took special care to tailor menus for every culture. Rice for the Japanese, spicy stews for the Africans, beef and bread for the Americans. It was not just hospitality, it was diplomacy through taste. The first events began in the glimmering arenas across the city. At the swimming complex, the clear waters reflected the white marble statues surrounding the pool, frozen athletes from ancient times watching over their modern descendants. There, American swimmer Chris Von Salza and the Australian Dawn Fraser ignited one of the great rivalries in women's swimming. Their strokes, powerful and graceful, cut through the water like twin blades. At the Stadio Olimpico, the decathletes began their 10-event ordeal, a test of endurance and versatility that mirrored the games themselves. Among them were Rafer Johnson of the United States and C.K. Yang of Taiwan, teammates at UCLA but rivals in Rome. Their friendship became one of the defining stories of the Olympics. Two men from opposite sides of the world, pushing each other beyond exhaustion, helping one another even as they fought for gold. Johnson, the American, would ultimately win by a narrow margin, collapsing in Yang's arms at the finish. It was an image that seemed to defy the politics of the age. Two competitors, one black, one Asian, united by respect. Time magazine called it the most human moment of the games. Meanwhile, in the boxing ring, a tall, lean 19-year-old from Louisville, Kentucky, danced his way into history. His name was Cassius Clay, though the world would one day know him as Muhammad Ali. With lightning reflexes and words as sharp as his punches, he charmed the crowd and outboxed his opponents with effortless grace. When he won the light heavyweight gold, he leapt around the ring shouting, "I shook up the world." Few could have guessed how prophetic that would become. Elsewhere, in the women's sprints, another American captured hearts. Wilma Rudolph, who had once been crippled by polio as a child. Now her stride was pure poetry, long, fluid, unbreakable. She won not one, not two, but 3 gold medals, becoming the fastest woman on earth. Her triumph inspired generations of young girls, proving that grace could rise from suffering, and that the games were not just about victory but redemption. Beyond the medals and cheers, something deeper was stirring. The Rome Olympics marked the arrival of new nations, independent voices from Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. For the first time, countries like Ghana, Nigeria, and Morocco marched under their own flags. Their delegations were small, their resources modest, but their presence was monumental. They represented the end of colonialism, the dawn of a new era in global sport. The journalists of the time called it the Olympics of Change. Because change was visible everywhere, in the athletes' faces, in the accents echoing across the village, in the way the old powers now shared the stage with the new. Television cameras, bulky and black, moved among the crowds, their cables snaking across the ground. Technicians wiped sweat from their brows in the Roman heat. For the first time, the Olympic Games were being broadcast live to millions of homes across Europe and North America. Families gathered around flickering screens to watch history unfold in real time, the first truly global audience for sport. The effect was electric. Children in London, Paris, and New York sat wide-eyed as athletes sprinted beneath the same Roman sun that had once shone on gladiators. It was as if the entire world had been invited into the same stadium. For Italy, these games were a renaissance of pride. The press hailed Rome as the jewel of civilization once more. The city's monuments became backdrops for new legends. The baths of Caracalla echoing with applause from fencing duels, the Basilica of Maxentius transformed into a gymnastics hall, the Colosseum witnessing, for the first time in centuries, not blood but brilliance. Each event carried echoes of the past. Each victory added a new chapter to Rome's timeless story. But beyond the arenas, another narrative was quietly forming, one that would capture the soul of the games and become its eternal symbol. It began far from Rome in the highlands of Ethiopia, where a soldier trained on dusty roads with no shoes. He did not yet know that destiny was calling him to the streets of the eternal city. But in the final days of the games, his name would rise above them all. For now, though, the world was still arriving, marching, sweating, competing, learning. Rome 1960 was more than an Olympics. It was a mirror reflecting the transformation of humanity itself, from division to unity, from empire to equality, from silence to the shared roar of nations meeting again under the same sun. By the end of the first week, Rome had become something more than a host city. It was the beating heart of the world. The marble streets pulsed with the rhythm of athletes and spectators, journalists and dreamers. Every morning, the air above the Tiber carried the smell of espresso and wet stone. Every night, the sky over the Stadio Olimpico glowed with the light of competition. Locals had begun calling the athletes, I figli del mondo, the children of the world. Everywhere, Romans opened their doors and their hearts. Shopkeepers handed out fruit to runners. Families invited gymnasts to share dinner. Children followed cyclists down narrow alleys, cheering in a dozen languages at once. For a few enchanted weeks, the eternal city was truly eternal again, not as an empire of conquest but as an empire of fellowship. The architecture of Rome became an active participant in the games. Fencing took place under the open sky at the baths of Caracalla, where ancient arches framed the lunging silhouettes of modern athletes. In those marble ruins, once echoing with the voices of emperors, the clang of steel and the sharp gasp of spectators created a strange harmony, the past watching the present with approval. In the Basilica of Maxentius, gymnastics unfolded beneath vaulted ceilings built in the 4th century. Rings and bars hung where Roman banners once did. When the gymnasts spun and leapt, their movements seemed like prayers whispered to history. Commentators called it the most beautiful arena ever built for sport. And at the Foro Italico, statues of idealized Roman athletes, carved decades earlier under Mussolini's regime, now stood silently as witnesses to a new era, where competition no longer served ideology, but humanity. The irony was not lost on anyone. Rome, once a stage for propaganda, had become a theater of peace. Cameras rolled everywhere. This was the first Olympics captured in cinematic color, not just black and white newsreels but living hues. The blue of Italian skies, the white marble of temples, the gold of afternoon sunlight over the Tiber. Directors from Cinecittà shot reels that would later be assembled into the Grand Olympic Night, a film that turned sport into art. Every evening, spectators poured into cafes to discuss what they had seen. In Trastevere, the laughter of tourists mingled with the excited Italian commentary spilling from radios. In piazzas, the victories of strangers became everyone's victories. The world was learning the same lesson, that beauty and competition could coexist. Inside the Olympic Village, friendships deepened. At dusk, music drifted from open windows. A guitar from Spain, drums from Ghana, violins from the Soviet Union. Athletes traded pins, jerseys, and stories. Some fell in love. Some found, for the first time, that their supposed rivals were not enemies at all. In the press center, journalists from 59 nations worked side by side, their typewriters clattering in a symphony of deadlines. Many wrote that these games were unlike any before, the last romantic Olympics, as one French reporter called them, before sport became pure industry. Indeed, there was something old-fashioned about Rome 1960, a kind of innocence. The commercialism that would later dominate the games had not yet arrived. There were no giant logos, no corporate sponsorships. Only athletes, nations, and the simple pursuit of excellence. But behind the grace and glamour, tension simmered quietly. The Cold War rivalry still lingered in subtle ways, in medal counts, in whispers of state training programs, in the eyes of coaches measuring their opponents. The Soviet Union led the medal table with the United States close behind. Each victory became a headline in a proxy war of ideology. Still, the athletes themselves often refused to play along. When Soviet gymnasts won, American athletes applauded. When Americans triumphed, Soviet photographers rushed to capture the moment. Somehow, amid all the politics of the 20th century, sport reminded the world of its shared humanity. The evenings in Rome shimmered with stories. At the equestrian events in Piazza di Siena, horses galloped under the cypress trees as the audience applauded in polite rhythm. At the rowing venue in Lake Albano, the still water mirrored the sky, disturbed only by the sweep of oars and the shout of coxswains. Each event carried its own poetry, fleeting moments of effort and grace that would linger long after the medals were forgotten. But among all these competitions, whispers began to spread about one event yet to come, the men's marathon. It was to be held on the final evening of the Games, beginning at twilight and ending under the floodlights of the Arch of Constantine. The route would wind through the heart of Rome, tracing the Via Appia Antica, the same road once trodden by Roman legions returning from victory. There was symbolism in that choice. The marathon, perhaps more than any other event, echoed the ancient spirit of endurance. And here, in Rome, the city of endurance itself, it promised to be the ultimate test. Few knew the names of the marathoners who would compete. Among them were champions from Europe, Asia, and the Americas. But one name, quietly written in the start list, belonged to a man who had never before run on European soil. A man who would soon turn the Games, and the world, on its head. For now, though Rome basked in its golden days, from the domes of St. Peter's to the steps of the Colosseum, the air vibrated with the energy of a world rediscovering itself. These were not merely games of muscle and record. They were a celebration of civilization's resilience. Each sunrise brought the echo of church bells mingling with starting pistols. Each sunset bathed the city in the same light that had once touched emperors and gladiators. And as the final days approached, anticipation grew. The crowds were ready. The cameras were ready. History was ready. Because somewhere, in a quiet corner of the Olympic Village, a soldier from Ethiopia was lacing up, or rather not lacing up, for the race that would change everything. The final night of the Games descended over Rome like a slow, golden curtain. The August air was heavy, alive with heat and history. The marble of the eternal city seemed to glow from within, as if the stones themselves remembered every triumph that had ever passed through its streets. It was Saturday, September 10, 1960, the last great race of the 17th Olympiad, the marathon. At 6 o'clock in the evening, as the sun began to fall behind the hills, 79 runners gathered near the Piazza di Campidoglio. Among them were champions from the Soviet Union, France, Great Britain, Japan, and the United States. Some wore custom-made racing shoes, sleek and bright. Others tightened their laces one last time. And then there was one man who wore none at all. His name, spoken softly among the officials, was Abebe Bikila, number 11 on the start list, representing Ethiopia. He was a member of the Imperial Guard, a soldier who trained in the highlands of Africa, running along dirt roads at nearly 8,000 feet above sea level. His coach, a Swedish military advisor named Ani Niskanen, had recognized his potential only months earlier. But when Bikila arrived in Rome, the shoes he was given by the team did not fit. They rubbed, they blistered, they bled. And so, he made a choice that would become legend. He would run barefoot. For many it seemed madness. The cobblestones of Rome were uneven, ancient, unforgiving. But for Bikila the ground felt like home. He had trained his entire life without shoes. The earth was his companion, his teacher, his resistance. To him, running barefoot was not defiance, it was truth. As the gun fired, the runners surged forward, their footsteps echoing through the narrow Roman streets. The course wound past fountains, palaces, and centuries. Spectators leaned from balconies, waving flags and torches. The city, a living museum, had become a racetrack. At first, the Europeans took the lead, setting a brisk pace. Bikila remained quiet, steady, his eyes fixed on the rhythm of his breathing. Kilometer by kilometer, he advanced through the field. He passed one runner, then another, his stride light and silent, the whisper of bare feet against stone. By the halfway point, the sun had disappeared, and the race became a duel in darkness. Torches flickered along the route, casting shadows on the ancient walls. Through the dim light, the figure of the Ethiopian soldier began to emerge as something almost mythic, moving effortlessly where others faltered. As they reached the 25-kilometer mark, Bikila overtook Sergei Popov of the Soviet Union, the world record holder. Then he began to chase down Radi Ben Abdesalam of Morocco, the last man ahead of him. 4 miles they ran side by side through the Roman night, Africa against Africa, two men from lands newly awakening to independence, running past the ruins of an empire that had once claimed both their nations. It was not just a race of endurance. It was history in motion. At the 35-kilometer mark, Bikila's breathing deepened, but his pace never faltered. The streets were now lined with spectators holding candles and shouting in dozens of languages. They did not know his name, but they could feel his purpose. Then came the Colosseum. The torches burned brighter there, the arches towering above him like the gates of time. And as Abebe Bikila passed under those ancient stones, something seemed to shift, the ghost of Rome's past yielding to the spirit of a new age. With 2 kilometers left, he broke away. Ben Abdesalam tried to follow, but Bikila was no longer running against men. He was running toward destiny. He entered the final stretch, the Via di San Gregorio, leading toward the Arch of Constantine. The lights of the stadium shone in the distance like a halo. His face was calm, almost serene, as if the effort cost him nothing at all. Then, with no celebration, no raised arms, he crossed the finish line barefoot, a silhouette against eternity. The clock stopped at 2 hours, 15 minutes, and 16.2 seconds. A new world record. Silence hung for a moment, disbelief, awe, before erupting into applause that rolled through the night like thunder. An unknown soldier from Africa had conquered the streets of Rome. He had done so without shoes, without fear, without fanfare. When journalists asked him later why he had run barefoot, Bikila answered simply, "I wanted the world to know that my country, Ethiopia, has always won with determination and heroism. His words carried weight far beyond sport. 25 years earlier, Italian troops had invaded Ethiopia. Now on the same soil an Ethiopian stood victorious. History had turned full circle. That night, the medal ceremony was held under the open sky. As the Ethiopian flag rose, the band played its anthem, a melody few in the audience had ever heard. Bikila stood on the podium, tall and unassuming, gold around his neck, dust still clinging to his legs. He did not smile. He did not need to. His silence said everything. For Ethiopia, his victory was more than athletic triumph. It was redemption, a statement of dignity and resilience from a nation long underestimated. For Africa, it marked the dawn of a new chapter. Within a decade, African runners would dominate the world's long-distance races, tracing their lineage back to the barefoot soldier of Rome. For the world, it was a reminder that greatness can rise from humility, that strength can emerge from simplicity, that courage sometimes needs no armor. When Bikila returned home, he was greeted by thousands. The Emperor Haile Selassie awarded him the Star of Ethiopia. But Bikila himself remained modest. He continued to train, still running through the highlands, still silent, still grounded, literally, to the earth. The marathon of Rome had ended, but its echo would never fade. In that race, amid the ruins of empires and the light of torches, humanity had glimpsed something timeless, the quiet victory of the spirit over circumstance. Abebe Bikila had not just won a race. He had changed the meaning of victory itself. When the Olympic flame finally dimmed above the Stadio Olimpico, the city of Rome exhaled, a deep, collective breath of satisfaction and wonder. The games of the 17 Olympiad had come to an end, but the echo of their triumph lingered over the Tiber like the last note of a symphony. 17 days earlier, the world had arrived divided, by borders, by ideology, by the lingering scars of empire. Now, as delegations packed their flags and medals, they left behind something rare, a sense of unity, however brief, that felt almost sacred. Rome 1960 had not simply hosted the world. It had reminded the world what it could be. In those 2.5 weeks, the Olympic Games had become something more than competition. They had become a reflection of a planet in transition, one stepping out of the shadow of war into the fragile light of a shared future. The newspapers called them the Games of the Beautiful. Historians would later call them the Games of Change. For the first time, the Olympics were not just a display of power or prestige, but of possibility. Abebe Bikila's barefoot run became an instant legend, not merely because he had won, but because of what his victory symbolized. It was Africa's first Olympic gold in a distance event, achieved in the very capital of the continent's former colonizer. His serenity on the podium, his humility in victory, turned him into a symbol of quiet defiance. He had no need for grand speeches. His stride had already spoken for him. Long after the crowds left, the images of that night circulated around the world. In the slums of Nairobi and the villages of Ghana, boys began to run barefoot, whispering his name. In Addis Ababa, murals appeared on walls, a silhouette of a runner, head held high, feet touching the earth. And in the years to come, from Kipchoge Kino to Haile Gebrselassie, from Tegla Lorup to Eliud Kipchoge, generations would trace their lineage to the barefoot soldier of Rome. But Bikila's triumph was only one of many stories that gave these games their immortal quality. There was Wilma Rudolph, the girl who once wore leg braces, now walking with gold around her neck, a symbol of endurance and equality. There was Cassius Clay, who would soon rename himself Muhammad Ali, carrying not just a medal but a mission that would change both sport and society. There was Rafer Johnson, the decathlete whose friendship with C.K. Young turned rivalry into brotherhood. And there was the rise of women in sport, their presence stronger, their victories louder, their names finally remembered. Rome 1960 was also the birth of the modern Olympics. Television had transformed the Games into a global stage. For the first time, nations could share the same moment, the same emotion in real time. From London to Los Angeles, from Cairo to Cape Town, living rooms became miniature stadiums. The world had found a new ritual, the gathering around the glow of a screen to watch humanity at its best. Behind the scenes, the Italian organizers had achieved the impossible. They had blended antiquity with innovation, transforming ruins into arenas and monuments into living theaters. The baths of Caracalla, the Basilica of Maxentius, the Via Appia. These names, once belonging to history books, now belong to sport. The architects of Rome 1960 had built more than venues. They had built symbols. Even the small details carried meaning. The medals, designed by sculptor Giuseppe Casilli, bore the image of the goddess of victory, Nike, her outstretched arm mirroring the motion of the athletes who had earned her favor. The torch relay, running through Greece and Italy, had rekindled the connection between the ancient and the modern, the sacred and the secular. Every gesture, every note, every design decision seemed to say the same thing: that humanity, though fractured by time, could still create beauty together. And Rome itself had been reborn. Tourism boomed. The streets that had once echoed with despair now rang with laughter and languages from around the world. The city's reputation, damaged by years of war and dictatorship, was restored. La Dolce Vita was no longer just a film, it was a feeling. For the athletes who lived it, Rome became a memory frozen in gold. Many would return years later, walking the same streets with gray hair and slower steps, pausing to look at the Colosseum and whisper to themselves, "I was here. I ran here. I became myself here." Abebe Bikila too would return, not to Rome but to the Games. 4 years later in Tokyo he would win again, this time wearing shoes, breaking his own record. He would become the first man in history to win back-to-back Olympic marathons. His legend was sealed, yet his humility never wavered. He remained the quiet soldier, the man who let his feet speak louder than words. Years later tragedy would strike. A car accident left Bikila paralyzed from the waist down. But even then his spirit endured. He learned archery, table tennis, and participated in the Paralympics. He continued to inspire, not by running but by living. A reminder that courage is not measured by the distance we cover, but by how we face what stops us. When he passed away in 1973, the world mourned him as more than an athlete. He had become a symbol of Africa's awakening, of human dignity, of the unbreakable link between body and spirit. In Addis Ababa, a stadium was named in his honor. In Rome, visitors still walk the Appian Way, tracing the path he took under the torchlight, feeling the ghost of his footsteps in the cobblestones. The story of Rome 1960 does not end with Bikila, but it cannot be told without him. Because in that summer, when the world came together, when new nations found their voice, when technology united humanity instead of dividing it, his race captured the very essence of what the Games could be. Not war but endurance. Not conquest but connection. Not empire but empathy. As night fell on the closing ceremony, fireworks burst above the city, reflecting on the Tiber like constellations. The athletes marched one last time, their flags waving in the warm Roman air. And the voice of the announcer echoed through the stadium. "Arrivederci, Roma." The crowd cheered, then quieted. Some wept. Others simply stared into the sky, unwilling to let go. Because they knew, even then, that they had witnessed something that would never happen again. The Rome Olympics were not just games. They were a turning point, a bridge between eras. Ancient and modern, imperial and democratic, sacred and human, all meeting in one city, one moment, one heartbeat. And in that heartbeat, the sound of bare feet against stone, the cheer of the crowd, the echo of history, the spirit of Rome lived again. Long after the banners were folded and the medals stored away, the memory of Rome 1960 continued to burn, a flame that refused to fade. Cities would host greater games, richer games, louder games. But none would ever recapture the balance of beauty and innocence that Rome achieved in that summer of rebirth. For many, it was the last time the Olympics truly belonged to the people. Before the era of billion-dollar sponsorships and political boycotts, before marketing and television rights, there was Rome, pure, proud, and unguarded. The athletes had walked among citizens, not behind barricades. The city had been their home, not their stage. And that is why the memory endures. In the decades that followed, the world changed. The Cold War deepened and later dissolved. Empires ended. Nations rose. Technology shrank the planet to a digital pulse. But the images of Rome 1960 remained, sunlit, timeless, eternal. Black and white film reels became color memories. Wilma Rudolph crossing the finish line, her arms lifted in triumph. Cassius Clay dancing in the ring, grinning like a prophet of his own destiny. Rafer Johnson collapsing into CK Yang's arms, exhausted but smiling. And Abebe Bikila, running barefoot into immortality. Each of them had carried more than their own hopes. They had carried the hopes of humanity at a moment when humanity needed them most. Rome 1960 was not born of perfection. It came from imperfection, from a world recovering, rebuilding, rediscovering its faith in itself. It was a promise that no matter how dark the past, there could still be light ahead. The Olympic flame, once lit in Olympia and carried across the Mediterranean to Rome, had done more than ignite a cauldron. It had reignited belief. Belief that courage could be simple. That greatness could be quiet. That unity could exist, even if only for 17 days. And as the torch moved on, to Tokyo, to Mexico City, to Munich and beyond, it carried the echo of that Roman summer in its fire. Each generation of athletes, knowingly or not, inherited its warmth. When Abebe Bikila died in 1973, at only 41 years old, the world mourned not just a man but an idea. At his funeral in Addis Ababa, tens of thousands gathered to say goodbye. Emperor Haile Selassie himself attended, his head bowed in respect. The barefoot runner who had conquered Rome now lay at rest beneath Ethiopian soil, the same earth that had shaped his strength. But his spirit did not die. In the decades that followed, children across the world would run barefoot down dusty roads, their laughter echoing like his footsteps. His story became legend, told in schools, whispered by runners before races, invoked by those who believe that courage requires no armor. Even now, in the early dawn of a marathon, when the crowd falls silent and the world seems to hold its breath, there is something ancient in that silence. It is the sound of every runner who ever dared to test his own limits, from Phidippides in ancient Greece to Abebe Bikila in Rome. It is the same heartbeat, steady and eternal. And Rome itself remembers. Walk down the Via Appia Antica today, where weeds grow between the cobblestones, and you can almost hear it, the rhythm of footsteps in the night, the roar of the crowd, the breath of a man who carried a continent on his shoulders and asked for nothing in return. The Arch of Constantine still stands, just as it did on that September evening. The air there is quiet now, but if you close your eyes you might see him. A silhouette beneath the torches, gliding past the ruins, unhurried, unafraid, unshod. The Games of Rome 1960 were more than a chapter in history, they were a turning point in the story of humanity. They showed that strength could coexist with beauty, that competition could coexist with compassion, that victory could be humble. They transformed sport from spectacle into symbol. And perhaps that is why, even after all these years, when the Olympic flame is lit and the anthem rises, something of Rome still lingers in the air. A whisper from that summer when the world rediscovered itself. When athletes became ambassadors. When one man's bare feet rewrote what victory meant. Rome 1960 remains the heartbeat of the modern Olympics. A reminder that even amid the ruins of the past, hope can run again. Because the torch that burned above Rome's sky that summer never truly went out.